I caught a video the other day in which Andrew Bolt and Daisy Cousens were discussing the issue of how leftists view conservatives as evil. And this, of course, affects the way they deal with conservatives in debates, things like violence on campus, violent shutdowns of events where conservatives are the speakers at universities and so on. And this is not new to me. I've been thinking along these lines for a long time. It's a very real thing that you really need to factor in when you look at what's going on in the cultural scene in the Western world. What engaged me about the discussion was that I remember some years ago in the canteen where I worked in the public service, which is the Australian public service, which is infested with leftists. And I must digress by just mentioning that for years, in fact decades, I've been absolutely disgusted by the degree to which Australian public service servants are so trenchantly leftist. And it was very interesting when Trump got elected that he was campaigning, crusading against what he called the deep state, which didn't mean much to me when I first heard the expression. But then it gradually all came into focus that Trump was warring against people within the administration or the prospective administration, should he become elected, that he could expect pushback from people in the American civil service who are charged with enacting his policies that they fundamentally disagree with. And I viewed the deep state as CIA, FBI, all this sort of cloak and dagger stuff. And then I kind of made the connection that having worked in the Australian public service for as long as I had, if you had a kind of right-wing conservative, so-called right-wing conservative government that is directing government departments to do this, this and this in pursuance of their agenda, and I'm thinking, from my own personal experience working in the executive branch, I can just imagine the kind of conflict a lot of these people would feel. Well, I'm a leftist, I mean, what am I doing implementing these right-wing conservative policies? And then the penny dropped in the case of Trump and his prospective administration, that what he faced, it wasn't just kind of spooks in the FBI or spooks in the CIA, it was the entire sort of cultural establishment of the American civil service, many of whom, I dare say most of whom, would find Trump and his administration and his policies to be completely anathema to them, that they would oppose with every fibre of their being. The deep state, as I say, it wasn't these high-profile intelligence agencies or whatever. It was just your ordinary average Joe working in the public service who were doing everything they could to stand in the way of implementing Trump's agenda. Now, that was my digression. I'm just going back to the original point I was making about Andrew Bolt and Daisy Cousens. I remembered that some years ago, I was in the tea room being harangued by a typical leftist public servant who was bagging out Andrew Bolt in the most really sort of malicious, disgustingly abusive language. I won't actually say what she said. And I remember thinking at the time, I mean, Andrew Bolt, I mean, you may not agree with what he says. I don't agree with everything he says. I agree with most of what he says. He comes out with things occasionally I feel like throwing a brick at the TV, but he is, in all respects, a quite reasonably informed commentator giving his opinion, and there's nothing wrong with that. And the language this woman was using against him, I could hardly fathom the hatred this woman felt, the sort of sentiment she was coming out with, violently abusive sentiments towards a person that I see as quite a reasonable human being. And in line with this, some years ago, I came to the realization that what the left is doing is it regards conservatives, their philosophical view of the world is nothing much short of a religious view of the world. It's something that goes to the very fibre of their being. It's an existential thing for these people. And I was then struck by the irony of the people who are going to tell you that Adolf Hitler killed all these Jews because, he dehumanized them. Yes, he rendered them as subhuman. And once you have done that with any group of people, you are free to treat them pretty much any way you like, because these people are just evil. They're no better than rats that you would just exterminate. And the irony that of all people, leftists are going to really educate you about Adolf Hitler doing that. And of course, they're a specialist at doing that themselves, which also meshes with observations about how hate-filled leftists are in their campaign against, you guessed it, hatred. How is this possible? Well, it's because they don't see their hatred towards conservatives as being like real hatred. It's just performing a useful public service, to sort of rid society of these evil people. My standard formulation always was that leftists regard conservatives as either evil or stupid, and probably both. And when you get into the minds of these people, you can really understand a lot of where they're coming from. There's nothing so scary as a person who knows he is right. He is absolutely right. And the way that he is likely to treat another human being who gets in his way. And you've really got to understand this and get this about leftists. I always remember the expression, gazing into the abyss. It was applied to Nietzsche with his dark take on human nature. It's applied to Margaret Thatcher, who was willing to go wherever her beliefs took her, in whatever direction they take her. It's applied to Adolf Hitler, who can bring himself to murder millions of people, and of course any number of dictators of the left and all the rest of it, and various other people. It is not necessarily a statement that people are evil when we say gaze into the abyss. It basically is the thing of willing to see where your thinking must take you, good or bad. And this is a depth of analysis and a depth of thinking you have to bring to bear on this. And people who, from the conservative side, observe that leftism these days, going back to the new left of the 60s, is virtually a substitute religion. That's where you've got to place all this stuff. There's no point in talking at the periphery, talking around it. This is a religious crusade right up there with the actual Crusades, and with the 30 Years' War, and with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is where you've got to place this stuff, and stop treating leftists like perfectly reasonable people. They are very reasonable within their mental framework, within their own mental framework, but they are ravening beasts who must be dealt with on that basis. And another example of this, it isn't just Antifa punching people that you see on video quite frequently. There was the recent case of a man in Tasmania headbutting Tony Abbott, who was arrested and charged and sentenced for assault. And my take on this person was that, firstly, he described Tony Abbott as being a C. Now, Tony Abbott is a conservative. He has conservative social values. As the Prime Minister, he did some good things in the conservative cause. He did quite a lot of things, much to my astonishment, that could only be described as, well, I won't exactly call it sucking up to the left, but I mean, he bent over backwards to be nice, to politically, in some of his decision-making, to be nice to people who hated his guts. And I'm thinking, why are you doing that? They're not going to love you, they're just going to hate you more. From the point of view of a conservative, Tony Abbott was a very mild conservative, but he certainly had a reputation for being a staunch, devout Catholic moralist. But he was a long way by any reasonable person's definition of being an evil C. And I got to thinking about how a person can look at a person I view as quite a reasonable human being as being subhuman. Yeah, just subhuman and evil. And I looked at this man, this younger man, and what has he ever heard about Tony Abbott, the perfectly reasonable, little bit conservative minister and prime minister? What has he heard? What has he ever heard about this man? From his teachers, from just about everybody in the entertainment industry, from anybody he respects in society, from the media, from any important spokesman in society, from his friends, most importantly, his peers. That's the only thing he has ever heard about Tony Abbott, that he is a C. And what would any reasonable person do with a person like that? Well, they may not commit violence, of course, but if he did commit violence, if he was in any way inclined to do that, who could possibly object? I mean, this is a person, Mr. Abbott, a person of no moral worth whatsoever, a subhuman thing. So why wouldn't you headbutt somebody like that? The average person might fear prosecution for assault. Oh, the legal system might apprehend you and just sort of take its course, but that's just something we have to put up with. But nobody in their right mind could think that I've done something like really wrong, like morally speaking. I've just got the gumption to do something about it. But surely nobody could dispute, well, I could headbutt, I don't know whether I could, if somebody headbutted serial killer Ivan Milat, I'm afraid that I wouldn't be overly concerned about that. If somebody had headbutted serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer, yes, I wouldn't have been overly concerned about that, would I now? So for this man who's only ever heard one interpretation, one story about Tony Abbott, my question would be, why wouldn't you act that way? I mean, what would stop you? What would rein you in? Everybody he knows, has ever known throughout his entire life, has pushed that opinion of Tony Abbott down his throat, and that's sort of the only thing he knows. But it does show that you've got to get into the mind of these people if you're going to take them on, if you're going to analyse what they're on about, if you're going to deal with them, if you're going to understand their role in the scheme of things. These are people who dehumanise people on the other side to them, that is, the people they choose to hate. You've got to realise that it's not really hatred to them, and there's no earthly reason why you would see certain people as being anything other than subhuman, and be prepared, as they do, to stare into the abyss and be prepared to accept that there can be no compromise with these types. It's total war and total victory without compromise. That's it for now.